Good afternoon, everyone. Let me get started in one moment. Okay, thank you everyone for tuning in to our panel on cancer health disparities in the Black community. So just before we get started, I want to introduce Black in Cancer, what we do and what we represent. So Black in Cancer amplifies cancer researchers, clinicians, advocates, patients, and other cancer health stakeholders in the Black community. And we were co-founded by Dr. Henry Henderson and Sigourney Bell. And I'd just like to take a moment and thank our sponsors, Tiger Lily, Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center, and Cancer Research UK. So today we have a very relevant panel discussing the past and present of cancer health disparities. And recently health disparities has become more relevant in the mainstream discussion because of COVID-19. So I'm really excited to delve into our topic. I'd also just like to give a shout out to Dr. Henry Henderson and Dr. Wayne Lawrence for helping to create and organize today's panel, as well as the social media content on the Twitter today. So for the attendees, please feel free to type any questions that you have in the Q&A. Any questions that we're not able to answer live, we hope to be addressed on social media after the panel. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today. First is Dr. Erica Warner. Dr. Erica Warner is an assistant professor in the Department of Medicine at Harvard Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital, where she studies how the social and physical environment, including policies, stressors, lifestyle, and behavior, can affect cancer screening and risk, with a particular interest in racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic health disparities. She conducts clinical and community-based research. Dr. Warner has a bachelor's degree from Duke University and a master's in public health from Yale School of Public Health. Dr. Warner completed her doctorate and the Alonzo Smith Yerby postdoc fellowship, both in epidemiology at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Dr. Warner, if you could just turn on your video. Hello.
Hi, everyone.
And then our second panelist for today is Dr. Justin Moore. Dr. Justin Moore is an epidemiologist and biostatistician who joined Augusta University in 2019 as an assistant professor in the Division of Epidemiology, Department of Population Health Sciences. Dr. Moore received his PhD in epidemiology from the University of Alabama at Birmingham School of Public Health, followed by his postdoctoral training under the National Institutes of Health funded T32 Cancer Prevention and Control Training Program, which was completed at the Washington University in St. Louis School of Medicine. Dr. Moore's research explores the intersection between race and place on various health outcomes, including cancer and infectious diseases. Dr. Moore's work delineated that place matters for African American, Hispanic, and rural populations characterized by hotspots of excess mortality from breast cancer, lung cancer, early onset colorectal cancer, sepsis, and COVID-19. Dr. Moore.
Hello, how you guys doing?
So Dr. Warner, let's just start with a very simple question. What inspired you to do research in cancer disparities?
Yeah, I think, I have personal experience that led me to be interested in cancer. I lost my mother to cancer when I was a teenager. And from that time, I always felt like something that I did in the world needed to address that. Originally I thought I was going to be a physician. I thought about going into pharmacology because I was going to design medications to treat cancer. Ultimately, I became an epidemiologist. I think a lot of that had to do with my first job. So my first job out of college was doing cancer research. And it really solidified for me that was where I wanted to focus my research career. And it was also where I was really introduced. I mean, I personally experienced it, but introduced to the concept of cancer health disparities, in that job. And it really has been my guiding force since then.
Yes, thank you for that. So Dr. Moore, I'm going to pose the same exact question to you. What inspired you to do research in cancer disparities?
Thank you, Chris. That's a really, really good question. And like Dr. Warner, I think I'm along the same wavelength in how I got interested in epidemiology, how I was introduced to it. But I guess the caveat to it all is that I'm not just a cancer researcher, I'm a health disparities researcher. And a lot of that is rooted by the fact that I grew up very, very, very poor in a very underprivileged, disadvantaged environment, where, you know, like a lot of our, you know, people of color, African Americans, we see people die really young or early from certain outcomes such as, you know, diabetes, cancer, heart disease, really, really early. I lost my dad at like 9 years old to diabetes. So from that point, I knew that I wanted to do something in health. And like a lot of, I guess, minorities and people who come from underprivileged backgrounds, the only thing we know in terms of, you know, doctor is an MD, right? We know that if you're smart, you're good at science, you can go to school, go to medical school, you become a doctor. It wasn't until like I was introduced to epidemiology, like close to graduating with my, you know, my bachelor's degree in neuropsychology, and I had a mentor that was like, you know, you're interested in, like a lot of my interests were in population health, and she introduced me to epidemiology. And since then, I've been, you know, what I would call a health disparities researcher, a community advocate, and a lot of my research has centered around those disparities that we do see when you look at race and when you look at where someone lives. And regardless of whatever, I mean, if you look at a multitude of different cancers, you see some of the same patterns, whether it be colorectal cancer, breast cancer, lung cancer, early onset colorectal cancer, we see some of the same patterns, some of the same disparities. And then you can take those same outcomes and you can look at COVID-19, right? And we see some of the same disparities. So again, those are some of the reasons why it's close to home, is because I want to serve the community in which the communities in which I'm from. And I do that through my research, and I do that through some of my community work.
And so thank you to both of you for those answers. And, you know, one of the commonalities that I'm noticing is how lived experiences have shaped your path in your career and their importance. And this also speaks to why, you know, an initiative like Black in Cancer is so important, because through these lived experiences, we can contribute to our field. So today in this panel, we want to talk more about, you know, the past and present of cancer disparities. So one of the questions that we have is, when did cancer disparities become a huge topic? When, you know, was there a large investment into cancer disparities and talking about it in the field?
I can start with that one. So I mentioned my first job was working in cancer research, and it was really where I learned a lot about cancer health disparities. And it so happens that my first job was at the National Cancer Institute at the Center to Reduce Cancer Health Disparities. And I think the founding of that institute was a real, I don't know, one of the first big testaments to a commitment to cancer health disparities at the federal level and at the NIH, which funds so much of the research that we do. And so that happened in 2001. So we're not talking about that long ago. Prior to that, the Institute of Medicine, or not prior to that, shortly thereafter, the Institute of Medicine released a report called Unequal Treatment. Now, this wasn't specifically about cancer, but it certainly covered some topics in cancer. And it was really, I think, groundbreaking in that it illuminated a problem that many people within the field already knew about, but really spelled out in stark detail the extent to which there's unequal treatment within the healthcare system, and the extent to which people of low socioeconomic status, racial and ethnic minorities, particularly Black Americans, received lower quality healthcare compared to higher income and white individuals. And so I think like these things really brought health disparities as a topic into consciousness. But I will say that I don't know why I'm surprised by it. I shouldn't anymore. But when I, am out and about and I'm discussing the work that I do, and I bring up, that I study cancer health disparities, there are a number. It happens quite frequently that it's like, what is that? And then I sort of have to start talking about some data and numbers, and it still continues to be a revelation to people that I talk to, sometimes even within my own field. So I would say that it sort of burst onto the consciousness in the early 2000s. There definitely had been reports of disparities well before then, and is still, I think, a growing field as this week is a testament to that, I think.
Yeah, and I just want to second Dr. Warner. I mean, you did a really fabulous job of really, dissecting the timeline there. And yeah, with the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities, again, that entire funding agency organization within NIH wasn't started until 2000, 2001. But if you look at the research, if you look at the data, you can see pronounced disparities in a variety of different health outcomes from as early as the 60s and 50s. It's when you think about the role that structural racism or institutional racism played into like why so many African Americans are disadvantaged or don't have access to quality health care, live in communities that are underprivileged and underserved. It's kind of intuitive that we see some of these outcomes. And a lot of people don't necessarily understand how those systems come into play and affect individual health and are responsible for a lot of these deleterious outcomes that we see today. We have a long history in this country of health disparities. But I guess it being a coined term, and being, having dedicated funds for health disparities, we're kind of late on the scene. We have a lot of work to do before we mitigate some of the disparities that we do have.
Yeah, so that's actually a great segue into our next topic, which is, what exactly are these disparities? What are the social inequalities that we see that are contributing to elevated cancer risk or poorer cancer survival? Dr. Moore, let's start with you for this question.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So just in general, and a lot of the data that I'm going to share with you all and some of the statistics I'm going to give you, a lot of people don't know this, but if you have a computer and you have the internet, you can simply go to PubMed.org, I believe, right? And you can literally just put in like cancer disparities and it'll give you a plethora of different data that you can read and results that you can read for yourself. But in terms of numbers, right? So if we think about cancer, just cancer overall, there have been studies that have been done that looked at, just trends in different, the major cancers over a 20-year period, let's say from 1990 to 2010. And what we do see is that while we see increases in overall 5-year survival since, the 70s, 80s, 90s to now, what we notice is that African Americans still have a lower survival rate when compared to their white counterparts. And we see this for almost every cancer outcome there is. So with me mainly focusing on breast cancer, for instance, I can give you an example of, for instance, I believe like for white women, the 5-year survival rate is about 91%. But for Black and Hispanic women, we're looking at about 80% survival. And a lot of that is explained when you look at late stage diagnosis. Black women have an elevated risk of being diagnosed at a later stage. They have about a, what is it? I believe it was a 20% increased risk of being diagnosed with late stage breast cancer. And because of that, you're seeing literally like a 70% to 14% increased risk of death for Black and Hispanic women, respectively. So a lot of the disparities, and then there are a multitude of different socioeconomic, social determinants of health factors that we use in public health that drive these disparities. These are factors that are a bit upstream. So before you even get to the point of the individual, you're talking about, again, we're going to that systemic and structural things that hinder someone from having the quality of life that they need. We see that if you, let's say, for instance, if you look at some of the research that I've done, identifying hotspots for a multitude of different cancers, right? So if you look at breast cancer hotspots are associated with people who live in a community that has a lower proportion of physicians per 1,000 population, people who live in food deserts, people who have a higher uninsured rate, lower education, lower socioeconomic status, higher obesity. A lot of these factors, if you compound them together, then what's expected in terms of an outcome. And if you live in a food desert being defined as a place that doesn't have fresh food and produce and vegetables, then you're more likely to eat fast foods, right? You're more likely to eat foods or adhere to a certain dietary pattern that's gonna give you a higher risk of having not only cancer, but cardiovascular disease. And I mean, there's just a multitude of different factors at a community level that drive these disparities that we see. Dr. Warner, did you want to add anything to that? I mean, I could.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we could both go on. It could be the whole topic of tonight's discussion, but yeah, I think what you said, I would echo it in terms of, there are a multitude of what we now call social determinants of health. And I think the thing to really keep in mind about these social determinants of health is that they're operating on multiple levels. So I think oftentimes we think about individual level factors, or maybe we even get a little bigger than that, and we think about your neighborhood and the neighborhood characteristics, which are important. But we got to go even farther, upstream when we're thinking about social determinants of health and how they contribute to risk of cancer mortality, and health disparities in general, to policies. I recently gave a presentation where I was talking about health disparities, and I spent some time talking about redlining, right? Because redlining, if you don't know, was this process by which the government worked together with insurance companies to basically create different zones of residential areas. And it created areas that were redlined, that were places where Black people lived, essentially. And those were places where you would not get mortgage backing insurance. And so it essentially made it nearly impossible for Black people to purchase homes. And in the United States, a large part of family wealth is developed through home ownership, right? Owning a home, selling that home, or passing that home on to your children, using the wealth and the equity that comes from your home to finance your children's education, living in a place that has houses that are, someone just wrote about The Color of Law, which I'm just reading right now. Living in a place where homes are worth more means that your schools get more money through property taxes, and therefore, you see these disparate educational outcomes. So it's like, it's a spider web, right? That you can keep going deeper and deeper. But I think we have to acknowledge that there is a historical component to this, right? It's not just what's happening right now and your lived experience, right? right now, but history matters too and has implications for our risk today.
Yes, and Chris, I'm sorry, I just want to echo what Dr. Warner was saying again with the redlining. If you were to go to each major city or just places throughout America, right, and you were to look at the places that were segregated or that these redlining laws and policies were put into place, and then you were to just overlay that with a multitude of different diseases, you can even do it with COVID-19, you can do it with any cancer, you're going to notice a correlation between those places that were a high density of African Americans being subjects and only live in those residences versus whites being in a nicer neighborhood and having access to better care, being able to buy and own homes. You're going to notice that the communities, right, that have been segregated primarily to keep Black people in a certain area are going to have be associated with a higher risk of morbidity and mortality. There's a clear correlation, and I mean, just look at, one other thing, if you were, and this is another free utility that a lot of researchers and people just don't know about. If you go to, I believe it's area deprivation index .org, there's a researcher by the name of Amy Kahn that's derived this, or this an update of an area level disadvantaged score. And if you were to look at that, which basically takes into account a lot of the different factors that we just discussed, right? And it's on a scale from 1 to 10. And then it's color coded. So you can look at your neighborhood and you can see, well, if I live in a neighborhood that's 1, then that means that I live in an advantaged neighborhood and it's blue. But if I live in a neighborhood that's on a 10, then it's disadvantaged and it's red. You can take those same areas and look at just do an overlay of mortality and morbidity from these different outcomes, and you'll see a clear correlation. So again, this is a definite, strong historical correlation and context that we need to really understand. We need to understand what has happened in a lot of the systemic and structural things that America has allowed to persist for so long, has disadvantaged a group of people disproportionately.
Yeah, so thank you for those answers. And while we're on the topic of disparities research, we have a question from the Q&A, which is, what are your thoughts about how we describe our work? Should we describe our work as health disparities, or should we focus more on the positive and describe our work as health equity research? So Dr. Warner, would you like to answer that first?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's something that I wouldn't say struggle with, but that I've been thinking about. I think like in this year alone, there's a lot that's come up about language and terminology and wording, even to the extent, what terms we use for describing different groups. Is it people of color? Is it BIPOC? Is it, should we just be specific about who we're talking about and say Black, African American, Indigenous, instead of trying to use some different term that describes the whole group? So I think that I'm open, really open to different ways of thinking about it. And I definitely have made a personal goal of mine to talk about health outcomes and the health of Black and other people of color, not from a deficits model. I think too often we talk about ourselves and our communities from a position of what's lacking, and I think that there are amazing resources and amazing stories and talents and experiences that exist within all of us and within our community. So I think to the extent that, this question is getting at, this issue of like deficits, lacking versus pointing towards solution, which potentially, health equity does, I'm willing to use that terminology.
Yeah, so I hate to be so in agreement, but I concur with those thoughts. For me, so yeah, health equity definitely has a better connotation. I'm I'm all for using better verbiage to try to, you know, get boots on the ground. But for me, the biggest thing is to do the work. Like, I mean, for me, I don't care what you call it. I want to help those communities that need that I come from, that are disproportionately affected by all of these different outcomes. I really, so that's where, you know, I think my focus is on is doing the work. And I think for the most part, what happens, and I don't know how often you all have experienced this, but like being a person from, you know, these communities, and then now being on the research and clinical side, seeing how the terms, you know, health disparities and racial disparities and, you know, just all of the trendy or catchy phrases that people use in order to make their grant or make their research stand out. And there's a lot less effort. And again, just being at a medical school and just seeing how people really spend a quite amount of time in I guess those terminologies, but not necessarily having boots on the ground trying to do the community work that's necessary to you know, the translational work, the community-based participatory research work, the going, you know, the non-traditional screening approaches that we can be taking. So again, I could care less about the name that we give it, as long as our minds and our attentions are in the right places, and that, you know, we're putting the work in. I'm all for health equity because, again, it's painting a different perspective and it's taking away that negative connotation. That's what I have to add to that.
Yeah, I really like that perspective of just like, you know, we don't have to get caught up in the verbiage as long as we're doing the work that's necessary to see the change that we want. So we're just gonna switch gears a little bit, and I'd like to ask the question. So there's some controversy on the role of genetics in racial cancer disparities. So my question to you would be, what role does genetics play in elevated cancer risk, and how much do genetics have on cancer inequalities? So let's start with you, Dr. Moore.
Oh, thank you. So that's a really, really interesting question. And I think for the most part, and I was just looking through the research, looking through the data, seeing if I could, so like as an epidemiologist, we, you know, oftentimes we want to look at like how much of the variation in the outcome can be explained by these factors, right? So if we were to take, let's say, policies, and we were to take someone's personal level factors, and then take their, you know, within that person, you're talking about genetic factors, right? And how much of the disparities that we observe between Blacks and whites can be accounted for by genetic factors. I don't have that number for you. Dr. Warner may, I don't, but I will tell you that, and this, I'm a bit biased on this. A lot of the work, a lot of the disparities that we do see, again, and this is just kind of using a lot of the language that we've already iterated, right? Just been redundant, that we see, because of some of the structural disadvantages and racism and community level factors. There's so much that's upstream that we need to try to mitigate, that we need to try to deal with before we even get to like the major genetic differences driving the risk factors. Again, so like when you say, for example, when I say, you know, we have disparities in breast cancer, right? And we see that 91% of white women are surviving after 5 years, but only 80% of Black women. Yeah, that's a 11% absolute difference, right? And a certain proportion of that can be, you can say, okay, maybe 2 to 3% can be explained by Black women being more likely to be diagnosed with triple negative breast cancer, right? But one of the factors that we do see is that still Black women are being diagnosed at later stage disease, which in turn makes it more difficult to treat the disease, right? Which in turn is going to give you a poor prognosis and a lower likelihood of surviving. So and then you have to think about population health and a lot of these clinical studies that we do. You can even think about COVID-19 now and the vaccination trials. What's the proportion of people in those studies that are actually African American, right? So that we can actually have results that are generalizable for the larger population of African Americans in the US, right? Within each race, within each ethnicity, you know, within each groups of people, you're gonna see differences, whether it be cultural, whether it be systemic, whether they're gonna be differences. And in order to actually understand those differences, you know, we need to take into account all of those different cultural differences, but then also be a little bit more inclusive. Genetics definitely plays a role. Being a scientist, I'm an advocate of every science, so genetics definitely play a role. If it wasn't for our different disciplines, whether it be biology, physics, medical engineering, we wouldn't have the therapeutics, we wouldn't have the cancer treatments that we have today. But the problem is that a lot of people are still not getting the care that they need in the 21st century, given the type of the therapeutics we do have today. So yeah, I'm sorry if I spent quite a bit of time on that. I was thinking quite a bit about that question, and I'll hand it off to Dr. Warner.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I think that genetics are not a primary determinant of health disparities, of racial and ethnic nor socioeconomic health disparities, end of. But, you know, I think that it's a question that gets asked a lot, and I find that when you know, we're talking about particularly racial disparities, it gets brought up a lot. You know, I think from a misunderstanding of what race is, as though it's some genetically defined and determined state of being, when we know that it's a social construct, and that if you look at the genetics of people who are labeled Black in America, you're going to find ancestry from different proportions of ancestry from Africa, from Europe, from Native American peoples. And so, you know, we don't fit into perfect little bins in that way. You know, I think that when we talk about genetics and cancer, we've identified a lot of genes that are associated with risk of different cancers. There's a lot less evidence to show that genes are related to mortality or sort of outcomes once you've developed cancer. And I like to use the example of height when thinking about genetics and the sort of relative importance of environment and genetic germline genes. So with height, this is about 78% of the heritability of height is considered genetic. So it's a pretty highly heritable trait. But if you go to a community, a country, an environment in which there's massive childhood malnutrition, malnutrition is the biggest determinant of height, right? You'll have stunted growth across the board, and you won't see the sort of genetic variation in height that would otherwise have been observed in a population that had adequate nutrition in childhood. So, you know, there's always gene environment interactions happening, and in an environment in which you have disadvantage, inadequate nutrition, other factors, that becomes more prominent.
Yeah, Dr. Warner, I think that's an excellent analogy of height and how, you know, you could just have another factor that's just so much more impactful on the outcome than the genetic variation that might be underlying it. And I think that's important for the broader scientific, you know, cancer community to understand as we try and improve cancer health. So, you know, this panel is trying to address more of the past and present of cancer health disparities research. So I wanted to ask, you know, what changes over the years have you observed in this field of cancer health disparities or cancer health equity research? Let's start with Dr. Warner.
Yeah, I would say that in the sort of earlier days of cancer health disparities research, it was largely descriptive, because we had to establish for the field, for the community, for the government that disparities existed and the extent to which they existed. And I think there's still new disparities or areas in which we haven't achieved health equity that are being identified and discovered, and as new conditions emerge, so COVID-19 pandemic, we're in the middle of it, we're describing the extent to which communities of color have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic as compared to other groups. But I think, within the cancer field, we have moved more to mechanistic studies, really trying to understand and explore the extent to which, some of these social determinants of health we were talking about earlier contribute to observed disparities, trying to understand how the healthcare system, racism, bias, how all of that plays into disparities, a lot more research on that. And then also moving into translation. So how do we take the findings that we come from these epidemiology studies and apply them to communities to try and develop and implement interventions that can actually reduce disparities at the community level, within the healthcare system level, and how do we change policy to try and address some of these upstream causes of disparate health outcomes.
So it sounds like it's going in the right direction of actually doing the work necessary. Dr. Moore, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I definitely have just a few words to add. So along the same lines, Dr. Warner did an excellent job of explaining, just how we progress from descriptive to being more interdisciplinary. That is the one thing that I'm noting and looking at mechanisms, right, and how systems come into play. There is, within the past few years, I think that because of a lot of the descriptive research that has been done, a lot of the groundwork that has been done by, our forefathers of racial disparities or health inequity research, you see another generation of scholars that are, working and are not afraid to call it what it is, right? So for the first time, you're seeing a lot of, you have critical race theory, and you have people actually saying racism as an explanatory factor for a lot of the, the health disparities that we observe. One important book that was released by mentors of mine, that may be mentors of yours, that I think that anyone that's doing anything that's related to health disparities research, was released by APHA Press, the American Public Health Association. It's called Racism, Science and Tools for the Public Health Professional. The primary editor is Dr. Chandra Ford. I highly recommend anyone that's doing any racial disparities research, just and equip yourself with that book, because it's going to give you a lot of the language, a lot of the work that has been done, a lot of the resources that are already out there, and I'll provide you all with a link to that as well. But it's a really good piece that explains, just some of the history, explaining how when you go through 300 years of slavery, and then you have convict leasing all the way through Jim Crow, all the way up through civil rights movement, to now dealing with a lot of the issues that we're dealing with in society, how all of that plays a pertinent role, not in someone's individual health. There's terms such as, I don't know if you're all familiar with allostatic load. So allostatic load is basically the wear and tear on someone's life through their life course as a result from external stimuli, right? So we see that African Americans have higher allostatic load, this cumulative stress, when compared to their white counterparts from as early as 18. And that's something that persists throughout your life. And basically, this is a like imbalance, a physiologic imbalance that that subjugates you to being at a higher risk of metabolic disease, infectious disease, cancer, you name it. And a lot of that can be derived simply by the fact that, you know, just living within the skin, living with some of the, you know, the cultural norms that we accept as a society, that how that influences people's individual health. And we need to take ownership of that as a, you know, as a country and see what we can do to, of course, mitigate these disparities.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, relating to the last question, we're all academics, and I feel like in academia, the publication is like, you know, the currency. So one of the questions that I have related to the last question is, what are some advice that you would have on how to translate these findings into something that's tangible, rather than the angle just being, you know, a publication and academic accolades? And then also, how do you navigate the two, you know, needing to publish for your career, but also needing to, as Dr. Moore said, put boots on the ground and get the work done? So let's actually start with Dr. Warner for this one.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think you have to start with the end in mind. I think that's kind of the approach that I've been taking more recently. I would say that, you know, early in my career, I was doing kind of traditional risk factor epi with large data sets and publishing it in some academic journal with a discussion section where a paragraph said, and here's how I think this might be actually operating, you know, some hypotheses, some citations from some other literature about either what the mechanism was in the human body or in the community that explained my results. And, you know, after a while, I just wasn't satisfied with that. That's not why I became a scientist, and that's not my was my personal goal. I wanted to have a bigger impact than, you know, a journal impact factor. And so the way I've gone about that is by partnering with community, working with community-based organizations, working with, you know, local community health centers, with advocacy groups, you know, being an advocate myself. And I think, you know, one thing that has been a pleasant, I don't know, not surprise, but I would say that, like, academically, I've been rewarded for that. So I think there was a time when it felt like, you know, you sort of had to sort of stay on this straight and narrow path, and there was like a straight line for achievement and promotion in academia, and it was, you know, papers and talks and such. And those things obviously still matter. But one, you can get papers and talks by doing community-based research, right? We publish all of our work, and I think it's important to show that this work is happening. It's feasible, and it can yield really important results. And yeah, I think that, like, the effort that it takes to build those relationships has certainly been well worth it for me. It's been personally fulfilling, and I think it has created like a feedback loop for my own research, right? Because it helps me understand, like, what are the important research questions to be asking. I always want my work to be informed by what's actually happening on the ground, and not just, you know, what seems interesting to me. And so I think that's the way you got to do it, in partnership.
If it's okay if I add, so I agree again with everything that Dr. Warner was just saying. In academia and research, one of the biggest things that we are kind of faced with is you have to have that balance of course, publishing getting grant funding, and then every other task, service, thing that you have to kind of keep up with. And it can be overwhelming. But from my own personal experience, I think one of the things that has allowed me to be productive in the sense of, getting an efficient amount of publications or whatever out, is partnering, collaborating with other investigators, realizing that it takes a team. A team of scientists that all have some of the same, interests, and reducing these health outcomes, these disparities rather. So if you can have an interdisciplinary approach, so not necessarily working within a silo, and if you are an epidemiologist, for example, work with a health behavior expert, work with someone who does community work, because it only betters your science. Now, for me, the entire goal for my research is to actually have translational, life-changing community work that I do. So I think the second big thing is to do community work in some form or fashion. Start locally, volunteer. There are a ton of different organizations throughout whatever city you're in, whether that be, the Boys and Girls Club, whether you do something like you all have done here with Black and Cancer Week, and just bring awareness to issues that need to be talked about and discussed. A lot of people, and this is just, it's just a human thing to do, is we're quick to point out what the problems are, but then we're not necessarily willing to put in the work and the effort to get rid of that problem, or come up with a solution. So be solution oriented. Me personally, one of the things that I wanted to do is, again, do community work, do community outreach, partner with people within the local churches and within the local barbershops to do, healthcare screening, bring health services to people where they are, because oftentimes what we see, again, with the late stage disease and having these poor prognoses is that, people just don't have access. There's a lot of mistrust among African Americans because of, the history of what is going on in this country. So breaking down those barriers and meeting people where they are is really important. So I joined the 100 Black Men of Augusta as soon as I got here, because it was an organization that I was a part of as a postdoc in St. Louis, and they organically created the St. Louis barbershop tour, where they provided free health screenings to people in the underserved communities of St. Louis for an entire 2 months. So that's something that we're doing here in Augusta. And I mean, it may seem like a large task, but if we don't do it, who will? So again, in terms of publishing, in terms of getting the research done, you need to collaborate. It'll happen. If you're doing it with a passion, if this is something that you truly care about, then I think that is going to drive you, and it won't be as, it won't wash you out as fast. You won't wash out as fast. Or you may not wash out at all because it's something that you really care about. And then, of course, community work, starting locally, volunteer, just get involved.
Yeah, so thank you for those answers. And just to segue into another topic, you mentioned in your answer, Dr. Moore, that you need a team. So according to the NSF, approximately only 6.5% of PhD students in 2017 and less than 5% of faculty are Black. So, what impact do you think that these low percentages have on cancer research disparities, where it's, more difficult to form a team when you don't have the representation?
Yeah, so I when I say create a team, again, you don't have to have a team of everyone that looks like you, right? So they're going to be allies and people who care about the same issues, that really want to bring, about cancer awareness within, Black communities or whatever, and you have to partner with those different people. In terms of research, that's an ongoing issue that we have. And I think even when you think about what you all are doing with Black and Cancer Reach, so mentorship, right? So showing another generation on how it's done, because so oftentimes you don't see the representation in academia or in these fields or within these disciplines. Is the reason for that is because people don't know how to navigate that pathway and know how to get there. They don't have a champion. We're all fortunate being that we have our PhDs, we're in our postdocs, whatever. We have sponsors, we have people who are going to make sure that we're successful. We're gonna be okay, but we have to go back. And I know that it's an added burden, but if we do it together, it's a bit more attainable. But continued mentorship, and I think one of the advantages in what the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us is that you don't necessarily have to be within the same town or city to collaborate with someone. You can feasibly have a team. I still collaborate with a lot of my postdoc friends, and we publish maybe 10 papers to this date, and they're throughout the country. So just creating those networks, building from that, and realizing that it's a team effort, and with work, with help, this huge task seems a bit more achievable.
Yeah, definitely. And Dr. Warner, I just wanted to hear your perspective on, the lack of representation in biomedical research and the like, and what impact you think that has on cancer health disparities as well.
I definitely think representation matters. I think it matters, in terms of trying to build trust. I think it matters. I think we can probably all think of a time when you read something, looked at something, and you thought there was definitely not a Black person in the room when they made this, when they created this, right? And so, to try and ensure that situation is not happening in research, we need to be in all the rooms where decisions are being made, right? And so, I think it does have an impact on cancer health disparities in terms of the questions that are being asked, the study designs that are being used, the people that are being recruited into studies. We started off the session by talking about our what brought us into research, and we spoke about our personal lived experiences, right? And in science, we'd like to think that we are somehow unbiased by the scientific method, but no, we're all bringing our lived experiences into every room we walk into. And so that diversity of lived experience matters in our research. It matters in how we treat patients.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to be coming to a conclusion soon, but I just want to pose a final question to both of you, which is, what advice do you have for students and trainees that want to pursue a career in cancer disparities research? So let's start with you, Dr. Warner.
Yeah, I'm a big advocate for trying it out. So I think experiential learning is the best way to learn about what you like, what you don't like, to make connections. So I was always a person who did the summer science research program, the internship, the apprenticeship under someone, any sort of thing that you can do to help yourself be exposed to learn more about it. Because we're talking about cancer health disparities, but let's say you want to be a cancer health disparities researcher. There's a lot of ways to do that, right? Me and Dr. Moore are epidemiologists. You could be a cancer biologist. You could be in pharmacology. You could be in geneticist, right? So there are lots of different ways to approach this question, and we need people approaching it from all of those different ways. So I think the way to figure out what that means is to be exposed to it.
And I can be really quick because I know we're running out of time. So I second everything that Dr. Warner said. There is an overabundance of different disciplines that you can do in science that you can do within cancer health disparities research in itself. Again, like I was saying earlier, you can be an oncologist. There's so much you can do. There's pediatric cancer. There's so much that can be done. I think what we need to, just from, this is an anecdotal or own personal experience. Oftentimes I see that, and just as humans, I see that a lot of our youth are very inquisitive and are really quick to buy into conspiracy theories and, oh, I heard, this causes this, and I heard this causes that. And, if you think about COVID-19, I heard that 5G cell towers are causing this. That was something that we heard earlier on, right? So people naturally have this train of thought of where they come up with a hypothesis, but they never try to test that. So being in health disparities and just being in science and research in itself allows you it gives you the tools to ask that question, but then, to actually formulate the research, do the analyses to actually see if what you propose or what you hypothesize is actually true. And again, I'm an epidemiologist, Dr. Warner's an epidemiologist, but you have biostatistics, which is, just math that you can do, health behavior, policy, you can do law and be in health, cancer disparities research, right? So you don't even necessarily have to have a traditional pathway. In terms of science, you can be an advocate, you can be a community health worker. There's so much that can be done. So many different careers. You can be a nurse practitioner. I can go on and on and on. And the beautiful part about it is that you can change lives for the better. And you can, and I've seen this with some of my community work. You can literally save a life by talking to a person, having a conversation with them seeing a face that looks familiar. Hey, you look like my son, or you look like my granddaughter, or whatever. But then you're talking to them about this issue, and it clicks something in their mind, which makes them say, you know what, let me go get tested on this. Let me go do this. And they catch that tumor a bit earlier than otherwise they wouldn't have thought it. So there's a huge benefit. And it's not just monetarily. It's a contribution that you can do for the Black community.
Well, this has been excellent. I just want to thank our panelists, Dr. Erica Warner and Dr. Justin Moore, for taking time out of their busy schedule to educate us on this very important issue. I'd also like to thank the attendees for tuning in and educating yourselves on this important issue. And then I'm just going to plug that we have another panel featuring trainees at 7 p.m. today, where we'll be talking about the future of cancer health disparities research or cancer health equity research. So thank you and have a good day.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Have a good one.